Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I am here with Joe Heschmeyer of Catholic Answers and the host of the podcast, Shameless Popery. Joe, it's really great to have you back on the channel.
Thanks. It's really great to be back on the channel.
Well, Joe, you did a video or a podcast a few days ago about 8 common myths about the Reformation. And I've actually been wanting to do like a Reformation myth busting video for a long time because I think for a lot of Protestants, they kind of look back at kind of the stereotypes and myths about the Catholic Church in the 16th century. And they say, oh, see, this is how bad the Catholic Church can really get. And so, we have in the 80s, like, the nice Pope St. John Paul II, the smiling popes, right? But
Right.
really, if you go back to the 16th century, that's the real Catholic Church.
Right.
Well, Joe, do you have any thoughts on that initial kind of stereotype?
Yeah. I mean, I think that stereotype is really dangerous because we're getting one of the most mythologized sections of history. What I mean is that there's always a sense in which when we're looking at history, we have to remember, there's this saying that the victors tell the history. That's not quite right. The historians tell the history, but the historians might have their own biases. And so in the English speaking world, a lot of what we know or think we know about this moment in the 16th century is being told through the lens of heavily biased Protestant authors or nationalistic English authors who have a real stake in the story that like the Reformation is this noble thing and is part of the liberation of England from the Roman Catholic Church. And, it's part of, if you're familiar with, the Black Legend, all these stories about how awful Spain was and the Spanish Inquisition. And these days, I mean, historians know a lot of this is grossly exaggerated or made
Right.
up. You think about the Iron Maiden and all those like torture devices. A lot of those things literally didn't exist, where they were just invented by carnival barkers or anti-Catholics or fill in the blank, where they're literally just making up things. So our knowledge of this moment in history is heavily tainted, and historians in this field know that. And so it's worth just saying, yeah, certainly there were problems. There were real things. And in fact, the Catholic Church has two reform councils in this time period. Like in the 1500s, you've got two attempts from the Catholic Church's perspective to do something like internal reform. So clearly, no one's taking the position there are no problems. But
Mhm.
these problems have been exaggerated to such an extent that in many cases they're unrecognizable, to the point of just basically a fictionalized version. So, think about George Washington and the cherry tree.
Right.
It's good to know that didn't happen. And it's part of just like a sort of mythologizing of Washington. Well, there's a similar kind of mythologizing of Luther, uh, to an extent that is frankly kind of shocking, because many of the most famous moments from the life of Luther, where if I just said, like, visualize three major events from the life of Martin Luther, at least one of those, there's a good chance it didn't happen.
Mhm. Well, Joe, I just want to say two things really quick. I think one is that in my journey from going from being Baptist to being Catholic, I had this realization that, Luther throughout my childhood, throughout my upbringing was kind of like this hero. And
Yeah.
then I had this moment where I kind of realized, the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah.
Basically, I realized that, oh, he was kind of, I guess to use a very colloquial phrase, like overhyped. And I
Yes.
realized that, like, oh, wait, actually, this guy had a lot of problems and his ideas don't hold up very well in scholarship, especially on the interpretation of Paul. So that's just one thing really quick. The
Oh yeah, no,
second,
I'm glad you, because actually I think you laid out two things there. One,
okay,
theologically, even Protestants are going to say Luther gets a lot of his major stuff wrong.
right.
So to take the famous example, in his preface to the Epistle of James, he argues against its apostolic origin, saying it wasn't written by an apostle and that it's theologically wrong because it contradicts sola fide.
Right.
Now, Catholics would be much quicker to accept that second point. We think it does, in fact, contradict sola fide. But Protestants who want to follow Luther have to say, yes, Luther is right on justification, except when he thinks James contradicts him on justification, that
Right.
he actually didn't understand James on justification. And so this is a major knock against him as a reliable theologian. I mean, if the idea is this is the guy we're getting our justification theology from, and we think his justification theology is wrong in his biblical exegesis of James, that feels like it should be a strike. You've got that issue. And then all the stuff with, I think you're alluding to like the new perspective stuff, where it's
Mhm.
saying a lot of the stuff Luther is bringing to the table, he is misreading what Paul is actually talking about. But then, even leaving all of that aside, you have this other category, which is just that Luther doesn't seem like a holy figure.
Mm.
That Luther seems like kind of a jerk. And in fact, I think we can say he gets demonstrably worse. Leaving the theological questions on the table, he gets worse the longer he's away from the Catholic Church. The
Mm.
more reformed he gets, the worse of a person he gets. So this is part of, if Jesus's admonition that you'll know them by their fruits means anything, it seems like this is one of the things we should be paying attention to. So
Right.
again, I don't mean this as like a personal attack. Plenty of even great saints have their blind spots, have their imperfections. But if someone makes a major change in their life, and the result of that change is they become worse and worse of a person, that is a red flag that change was not a change for the better. And so in Luther's case, he goes from early on being pretty pro-Jewish, quite progressive even by the standards of the day. And then by the end of his life, he's written on the Jews and their lies, arguing we should burn down synagogues and kill rabbis and deny safe passage for Jews. I mean, shockingly anti-Jewish kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not unrelated to his theological journey.
Right.
So if you understand kind of the story of how he goes from a good place to a bad place, it's part and parcel of his theological journey. Well, likewise, his view on the German peasants would be a great example of this. So one of the things in this episode that I talk about is that Luther is presented as kind of this hero of conscience and everything else. And the actual story is way more complicated than that. And so if you read his stuff on the German peasants have political uprisings kind of in Luther's name. And originally he's sympathetic, but eventually he turns against him and in fact advocates that they should be killed, both openly and clandestinely. In other words, he's openly calling for murder. This guy doesn't look like any saint I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just say that. Now, I didn't even touch on like 90% of what I just said there in the episode. I
Yeah.
just think like you've alluded to two things that are worth saying. One is that we can now see Luther's theology has no clothes, and that Luther as a man doesn't seem to have any clothes. If I'm following him as the founder of like the restoration of Christianity, I want him to be so thoroughly Christian that I can trust that I want to end up in the same place as Martin Luther for all eternity. And there's enough red flags in his personality and his behavior
Mm-hmm.
that hopefully someone sees this and says, yeah, there's some things that are really unholy going on here.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, as I said before, like he was presented to me in a very cleaned up, nice version. But when you start getting the whole picture, you're kind of like, there are real problems here. Um, the second thing I wanted to mention, Joe, was also just maybe to kind of make an empathetic point, because some people might say, oh, well, who cares? I don't like the Catholic Church. I don't think anybody really thinks this, but it's like, I want to straw man them and just make them look as bad as possible. I mean, for example, I've seen videos on other kind of Christian channels where they're correcting, for example, how Christians reacted to when Charles Darwin first published The Origin of Species. There was like, I forget, I think it was like a BBC documentary that made it look like all the Christians were panicking and saying we need to hold to the word of God. And it's like, in reality, the initial reaction from Christians to Darwin was much more nuanced and careful.
Yeah.
Or the Salem witch trials, right? Like it makes it look like Christians killed thousands of women. And it's like, okay, well, I think the numbers are like 20 or less, if I'm not mistaken. It was not nearly as high as people were thinking or portraying. And so
when you make that point, if you don't mind me jumping in, when you make that point, there's a really predictable response. People say, well, it's still terrible if 20 people died. It's like,
that's true.
Yeah, sure. But it's not even on the same scale. If condemning an entire religion over the fact that a group of people got scared and killed 20 people because they thought they were witches, it's a ridiculous reason to indict 1 billion Catholics or 2 billion Christians, whatever the number is overall. That sort of thinking is just so obviously fallacious. If you can't make your point without exaggerating the faults of the other side, regardless of what your side is, whether you're a non-Christian critiquing Christianity, a non-Catholic critiquing Catholicism, if your political side is critiquing the other one, and the only way you can make your case is by inflating and exaggerating and distorting the facts, then you have a weak case. You just do.
Yeah. Well, in order to stop with the inflating and the this kind of smearing generalization or falsehood, I think, Joe, we should get into the 8 myths about the Reformation. So tell us the first one.
So I actually want to give them in slightly different
Sure.
order than I gave them in the video because someone pointed out I should have done them in this order in the comments. So I want to honor that. So the first and biggest one is this idea about the indulgences being all about money.
Yeah.
So when non-Catholics hear about indulgences, there's this idea that can really easily come in that indulgences were just these like slips of paper that you purchased and they got you to heaven. And there's all sorts of, so even in that sentence, there's a lot wrong right there. It misunderstands what an indulgence is, also misunderstands the role of money in all of this. So one of the things I wanted to do was go back to look at how indulgences were being spoken of even in this time and place. And so I looked at the summary instructions that the Archbishop of Mainz had given in 1515. This is the Archbishop who is giving the instruction for the preaching of indulgences and explaining how to get an indulgence. And it's not cut us a check or hand us some coins. Rather, he specifies that it's open to everyone who is contrite in heart and has confessed with his mouth, or at least has the intention of confessing. And then there's several things that you're to do. You are to visit the 7 churches in which the papal coats of arms are displayed. So you're to do basically a miniature pilgrimage in your city, in your diocese. And then when you go to those 7 churches, you're to pray 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys in honor of the 5 wounds of Christ, or else 1 Miserere. So what is that? Psalm 51. Because Psalm 51 seems appropriate to obtain forgiveness of sin. So it's David's psalm after he has sinned in the killing of Uriah. And so it's, you're going into 7 churches and praying. And then you're contributing money. And so you might say, okay, well, why is there money at all? Well, the money is for the upbuilding of St. Peter's. Well, spiritually, isn't this the sin of simony? And the answer to that is no, but it can be distorted in such a way that it becomes that sin. So in the same way that a political contribution is good, it's legally protected free speech, but could become bribery if you're not careful. Likewise, we have to kind of walk the fine line on indulgences. And this becomes murky enough territory that the Council of Trent eventually just like gets rid of the financial aspect entirely because it's too spiritually fraught. But I want to give a half defense. I think the Council of Trent is right in kind of an abundance of caution to avoid this, but think about the biblical basis. On the one hand, we know that you can't buy heavenly rewards. You cannot buy your way to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So think about Acts 8, Simon the Magi, or Simon Magus, who tries to buy the laying on of hands. And St. Peter condemns him for it. On the other hand, God does spiritually reward generosity. And so you can't buy those spiritual rewards, but if you're generous, you will get those spiritual rewards. So there is a connection between how you're using your money and your receipt of spiritual rewards. So in 2 Corinthians 9, St. Paul talks about this at great length, that he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your resources and increase the harvest of your righteousness. That's if you give, that you'll be enriched in every way for great generosity. So you can't give for the purpose of those spiritual results in such a way that you're trying to buy it, but God really does reward generosity. He outdoes you in generosity. So sometimes we have to keep both of those things in view. And so a nuanced Protestant critique would say, yes, this is, there is a true spiritual reward with the person who is generous in the upbuilding of a church. And yet the way this is preached could easily lead people into a transactional way of thinking that is offensive to Christian theology. And that critique, the Council of Trent would accept, I would accept. But if the critique is like, there's no spiritual importance to how you give your money, well, that's totally wrong. That is not true Christian theology. How you give your money is very important. And the person who is really generous will be rewarded in heaven in a way the person who's stingy won't be.
Yeah, the point isn't about the quantity of money you give. It's about the heart by which you're doing the act of love or the act of service, right? That's the main point. I think about like in the Gospel of Mark, when you have the widow dropping 2 coins,
Yep.
right? I mean, that is a beautiful example of the point's not, well, the point is how much she's willing to give, right? It shows something about her heart and the purity of her intentions. And that's what the money is supposed to, like giving rather, the donation supposed to be an expression of. But then as you pointed out, it kind of got too mixed up with making it seem too transactional.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the kind of ironies about this was partly a result of the church trying to make it not like that.
Hmm.
So it, this is actually the second of the 8 issues, which is
Right.
that there's this idea that these were these massive amounts of money. So indulgences were basically only open to the rich. And in the video, I'm critiquing National Geographic, a video they made on this subject, where they basically say that. And this is just not true. There was a sliding scale how much you were expected to give based on how wealthy you were.
Right.
And
Hmm.
so we wanted to honor the widow's mite. We wanted to honor the widow who gives the 2 small coins. At the same time, there's some people who can't give it all. And so remember those instructions, the summary instructions from the Archbishop of Mainz that I mentioned earlier? He specifies those who do not have any money should supply their contribution with prayer, for the kingdom of heaven should be open to the poor no less than to the rich. So if this is all a scheme to just make money, that is a very strange set of instructions that the poor don't have to pay anything. And that this needs to be as open to them as it is to the wealthiest person on the block. And so, what you're called to give is going to vary based on whether you're a poor widow or a wealthy landowner. And if you're a poor widow, maybe what you're called to give is nothing but your prayers.
Hmm. Right.
That generosity is what we're trying to get to. Trying to put that in a scale probably made it appear too transactional. But I think it's completely valid to say the rich should be giving more. Should
Right.
be, generosity looks very different based on what you've been given.
Sounds good to me. All right. What's number 3?
Yeah. So the famous. Well, so what happens on October 31st, 1517?
Well, people say that Luther nailed the 95 Theses, right?
You're on me. You're on the case. Yes. So yeah, there's no evidence during Martin Luther's lifetime that that ever actually happened. He
Hmm.
wrote the 95 Theses, but all of the historical evidence seems to point away from it having been nailed to the door. And the standard response is, oh, well, it's totally standard practice to nail it to the door. The point isn't that this was usual or unusual. The point is Luther multiple times talked about the 95 Theses and how he sent them out. He sent them to the bishop. He sent them to some confidants. He never mentions anything about nailing them to the church door. Philip Melanchthon, in the second edition of his biography of Luther, is the first person to mention this after Luther's died. And Melanchthon doesn't claim to have actually seen this. It's just a word of mouth kind of situation. And so historians increasingly realize, like, we don't really have any good evidence of this. I was actually reading something on the numismatic evidence, like all of the coins and commemorations and things that Lutherans had prior to this point don't have any reference to the nailing of the 95 Theses. Of all the things they're trying to commemorate, nailing the Theses to the door of the church, the Castle Church in Wittenberg, is not one of them. And it's only after Philip Melanchthon makes this claim that this becomes part of the lore. And he's not an eyewitness, and he's not, Luther's not around to correct the record. And Joan Ocachella, writing for the New Yorker, was talking about how Luther was a self-promoter. He in a self-dramatizer. He doesn't miss an opportunity to tell these incredible stories about his own life, stories that may be true or may be fictitious. Think about the famous story of the thunderstorm where he pledges himself to Saint Anne. That stuff, you can find Luther claiming those things. Granted, decades later, we don't know how true those stories are, but at least he's telling these stories about himself. With the nailing of the 95 Theses, he doesn't even tell these stories about himself in any public way. We just have to say that, well, maybe privately, he told Philip Melanchthon a totally different version of the events. So, yeah, all that's to say, there's pretty good reason to believe it didn't happen.
Hmm.
And what's more, he's not protesting the doctrine of indulgences. He's protesting an abuse of the doctrine. Can I give you a trivia question here, Swan?
All right, go ahead. Let's see how I do.
All right. How many anathema clauses are in the 95 Theses?
How many anathema clauses?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll say I remember reading them a long time ago,
Yeah,
but
that's
I don't
fair. You didn't know
remember
you
the
were going to get
answer.
quizzed.
Was
This
it
is
0?
unfair. There's one.
Oh,
It's
okay.
Thesis 71. Let him who speaks against the truth concerning papal indulgences be anathema and accursed. So the only people he damns are those who deny indulgences, which is a very strange thing for Protestants to be celebrating, because they're literally celebrating a document cursing them to hell.
Hmm. All right. All right. Well, what's number 4, Joe?
Number 4 is on conscience. So again, I'm referring to a particular video, but in this video, it has the Diet of Worms and says, Luther was talking about conscience, and people at the time wouldn't have been familiar with that term or wouldn't have known what he was talking about. And right, you laugh, and you're right to laugh, because conscience plays a huge role in medieval philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole debate between synderesis and conscience, and like, what is it that we know? So synderesis is the knowledge of the basic principles of morality, and it's considered infallible. Like, you don't actually need someone to tell you not to do evil or to do good, because if you understand what good and evil are, you know good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Then conscientia is the application of moral principles to particular cases, and there you can err. So all that's to say that it was pretty standard custom to take Peter Lombard, so medieval school at the time, you did the studying on Peter Lombard as kind of university curriculum, and then you would do commentaries on this, including his work on conscience. So people were extremely aware of the role of conscience in medieval philosophy, and that's just Peter Lombard. Aquinas and Bonaventure also have
Mm-hmm.
works on conscience, and fill in the blank. And so St. Thomas More, to take one example, he's a contemporary of Luther. During his last year of life, I've got to find the stat here. He mentioned in his writings, he uses the word conscience over 100 times in correspondence. So the idea that Luther's contemporaries were unacquainted with the idea of conscience
Mm-hmm.
is absurdly false. But it's part of this kind of recasting a basically secular vision of Luther. And
Yeah.
what I mean by that is that, and there's a lot that could be said here. It's this idea that the bad old Dark Ages and the bad old Catholic Church, limited human liberty and freedom and all of that, and that Luther becomes a crusader for, depending on who's telling the story, Protestantism, or liberty, or conscience, or individual thought, or basically the Enlightenment. You get some version of that story told, and that just isn't true. So not only does Luther not have this radically new vision of conscience, Luther's vision of conscience is actually in some ways dimmer than the view of his Catholic contemporaries. So there are two major views of conscience in terms of the effects of original sin. And by 1517, Luther was of the view that there wasn't even a scintilla of goodness left in man. So you
Mm-hmm.
can't even say there's like good synderesis. It's still a God-given gift where you know to do good and avoid evil. So he has a darker view of conscience. And you see this come out in the Peasants' Revolt, that they're following conscience, and he says that their conscience is bad. And so he, in his Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants, advocates for killing them, as I mentioned earlier. And he says it is to their advantage that the peasants have a bad conscience and an unjust cause, and that any peasant who is killed is lost in body and soul and is eternally the devil's. So Luther's view is not conscience is sacred and has to be respected. Luther's view is, if you're in a state of original sin and you're not like a redeemed, solid Christian, you have an evil conscience. And not only do we not have to respect it, we can kill you knowing that it's going to send you to hell.
Mm. All right, Joe, number 5.
Here I stand.
Yeah.
I can do no other.
Yeah.
The most famous line in Luther's speech is another invention.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole long history as to how we get there. And so in the video, I actually talk about an article by Samuel L. Young in Lutheran Quarterly called How Luther Became the Mythical Here I Stand Hero. And he makes the same point I made earlier, that you have this movement to create a kind of Enlightenment, free thought, secular narrative, that you have this kind of myth of progress going on in one form for Protestants and in another form for secularists. And they're telling basically the same story, that there was the bad old Dark Ages and then the Enlightenment came. And maybe the Enlightenment is the Protestant Reformation. Maybe the Enlightenment is the movement calling itself the Enlightenment or the dawn of secularism. but it's that basic story. And so they're telling these really mythologized versions in which the Diet of Worms, that had played a relatively small role in Luther's actual life, uh, becomes this real pinnacle. And there's this amazing "here I stand" moment, and everything's been so heavily dramatized. And so I point to it not because there's a lot that turns on the "here I stand." I can
Hmm.
understand people who think that's just a quibble, but it's like, "I cannot tell a lie," and on the lips of George Washington. Like, these lines are being invented for characters for a reason, because they're being turned into these actors in a play that has an actual agenda. And so a wise listener and a wise interpreter says, okay, well, why are we inventing lines and putting them in the mouth of Martin Luther?
Hmm.
And why are we making him this great, defender of these principles he didn't actually have an unambiguous relationship with in his real life? Why has this happened? Where there's a flattening and a mythologizing of the man. Why not just tell the true story of the man, warts and all? Because there's a lot of great stuff Luther does, and a lot of really rotten stuff. Why are we telling a fictional version instead?
Right. And I think so far somebody might say, oh, well, Joe, these are all, well, some of them are pretty trivial, right? Like, I mean, these are
Yeah,
just small things that Luther didn't actually say or do, like the nailing the 95 Theses or saying,
right.
here I stand. But I think the point that you're trying to get across is, you should be a bit more cautious. I think all of us should be a bit more cautious on what we take as this is how it really happened, because
Right.
there's been so much propaganda and bias and just myth churning in the culture on this issue.
Absolutely. All of that. And in addition to that, the actual story of Luther's movement is one that starts out as an attempted reform in the church.
Hmm.
And the the bombast of the really, oh, here he is nailing the theses to the door, and here he is making a bold declaration at the Diet of Worms. It All of these things give a very revolutionary flavor to Luther that
Yeah.
in early Martin Luther wasn't his character. What actually happens is he's very confident in his ideas, is initially convinced everyone's going to agree with him, and submits the decision to the Pope, saying he'll respect whatever the Pope decides. The Pope decides against him on some of the important questions, and Martin Luther denounces the Pope as the Antichrist. That is a quite a remarkable story. It's like, well, you put the case to the judge, didn't like the judgment, and then denounced the judge.
Hmm.
That is not at all the kind of figure I think people are going to want to get behind. The bold revolutionary against a church unwilling to listen to reason. That's the version people want to hear.
Right.
And then, eventually the church realizes Luther's right at the Council of Trent. That's kind of how, the story is typically told. And it's like, no, it's much more complicated than that. The correspondence back and forth with Luther, imploring him as a son of the church to basically calm down and like talk this stuff out rationally.
Hmm.
And he just kind of flies off the handle. It's a very different sort of image. So yeah, I think even those small kind of details point to the creation of a basically false version of history. Like, the mental image that we have is untrue.
Hmm.
And it's untrue because of some intentional choices people made along the way.
All right, Joe, I think we're on number 7, if I'm right, or
Number 6, I believe.
number 6. All right.
Oh no, sorry, you're right. Number 7.
All right. Number 7.
Um, this is that Luther created the first German language Bible. I've heard this ad nauseum, and it's simply not true.
Hmm.
The Adventist scholar Kenneth Strand has multiple books on the subject. One of them called "German Bibles Before Luther," and he points out that even by the one thing to note, there I guess two things to note, is that a lot of European languages are in flux in this period. There's like the great vowel shift that happens in English, and we don't really know why. You've got the movement from Middle English to Modern English on the English side, and so a vernacular language Bible in 1400 would be basically unreadable by 1600. Likewise, in German, you have a kind of linguistic transformation, but you also have a second thing that's really important, which is the creation of the printing press. Prior to the printing press, everything's being done by hand. So the idea of doing like mass printed vernacular Bibles for the common people is literally impossible. And so, nevertheless, within this fairly short time after the printing press, Luther's born in 1483. By the time he's born, there are at least 9 versions of the Bible, the complete Bible, in High German and 2 in Low German. And by the time he publishes in 1522 his own translation, There were at that point 14 High German and 4 Low German editions of the entire Bible, plus numerous editions that had portions of the Bible or, various manuscripts. So all that's to say, the idea that he is this revolutionary figure for putting the Bible in German for the first time is literally untrue.
Hmm.
It just, when we know it, like we can point to these various copies that predated and it was uncontroversial, right? Like people were not like, how dare someone put the Bible in German? Ordinary people could read that. That's kind of the myth. But the reality is this has been done numerous times in
Right.
German as well as in Latin.
I mean, and usually, I don't know if this is number 8, but it's accompanied with the myth that like the church didn't actually want people to read the Bible for themselves.
I didn't even get into that, but I think a great example of that is the Cyrillic text, right? Like there's an entire text used by, and instead of, an entire alphabet used by hundreds of millions of people that is based on Cyril and Methodius inventing a written alphabet so they could put the Bible in the language of the Slavic peoples.
Mm.
That kind of information doesn't sit neatly, and they're sent by the Pope. And so, as missionaries, they realize the people they're preaching to can't read and therefore can't read the Bible. And so, their solution is we're going to invent an alphabet so we can put the Bible in the language of the common people. They don't just hand them Latin Vulgates and say, learn to speak Latin, peasants, and move on. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to find people who are, for various reasons, concerned about making the Bible too vernacular. So, I'm not saying there are no Catholics who object to vernacular languages of the Bible. Um, but even the Latin Vulgate is so called because it was in the vulgar or common tongue. What changes is that the common tongue changed over the course of centuries. So all that's to say, it's a way more complicated story than that. That is a total myth. I don't even cover that myth in there,
Mm-hmm.
but that is because that's a much broader than just Luther level myth.
Yeah.
But yeah, behind this idea of like Luther's revolutionary vernacular Bible is there've been tons of vernacular Bibles.
Mm. All right, let's get to number 8 then.
The splitting the church in two.
Hmm.
So this is the claim National Geographic that unintentionally Luther split the church in two. And I point out that neither of these descriptions are really true. It's neither completely unintentional, nor is the church split in two, split into way more than two. That if you look at just the major movements, Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, and Henry VIII don't get along. And he doesn't get along with the Anabaptists. He doesn't get along with the German peasants. He doesn't get along with any of these other like radical reformers. There's way more movements even during Luther's lifetime. So it isn't like he dies and is left behind a Protestant church with anything like a coherent doctrine or structure or is capable of making unified decisions. That rather he rejects the one visible church, and the result that he leaves us is a whole mess of competing intellectual systems and sects and denominations and movements that
Right.
cannot harmonize. And so like the Marbury Colloquy, there's the attempt to create something like a church council for Protestants. And Luther is there, and he and Zwingli can't agree on Eucharistic theology. And like on basic issues, they cannot come to agreement. And that's just two guys. That's the story of Protestantism much more broadly in the 16th century, and I would argue even down to today. And so he doesn't break the church in two. He shatters part of the church, I think would be a fair way of saying it. Whether you view that as good or bad, whether you view one of those shards as like having the right interpretation of the Bible or not, he doesn't leave a single thing behind called Lutheranism as like a church
Mm-hmm.
or Protestantism as a church. And then the other half of that is that this is all unintentional. Well, as I say, I think the original reform, there is something largely unintentional. I don't think he sees when he draws up the 95 Theses that this is going to break the church and all these different pieces. Nevertheless, when push comes to shove, what makes Luther different than church reformers is you could put it like this, and I've seen historians put it this way. Figures like Francis of Assisi were really troubled by the prospect of bad Catholics, people who were not living their faith. Martin Luther is troubled by good Catholics, people who are following the Catholic Church's teachings. And so his issue is not some people are falling short of their moral calling. That's always been true. That always will be true. That was true during the time of Jesus. Remember Judas. that's true today. It's going to be true in every era. If that's all Luther had to say, he actually wouldn't be that interesting of a figure. Plenty of people have played that role of calling out moral corruption in their day within the church. If you know anything about church history, it's replete with such examples, and with plenty of cause all the time, wherever you turn. What makes Luther different is that he actually says, no, it's not just that you've fallen short of the moral bar, it's that actually your bar is all wrong and your teachings are all wrong. So it's not the problem isn't that you're not practicing what you preach. The problem is that you're preaching false things. When you make those kind of claims, that is a schismatic sort of view. What I mean there is, sure, I'm sure Luther would have been fine if the entire church had become Lutheran. But if that's your standard for not wanting to form a new church, that he would accept one church if everybody agreed with him, well, then no one's ever been a schismatic. Because the whole point of a schismatic is I believe in my own interpretation so strongly that I'm willing to reject the consensus of the church and will break communion over this issue. And he does just this. I mean, burning the papal bull in a bonfire. I mean, to look at that and say it's not schismatic, I'm left wondering, well, who would you consider schismatic then? Like, he's intentionally breaking communion and later talks about it in those terms, like views it as a necessary schism. So if your view of Luther makes him less of a schismatic than he made himself, I think you have too Pollyannish of a view of Martin Luther.
Joe, let me ask you one last question. And it kind of goes back to something you said near the end there. I've heard some people say, look, it really stinks that we had these types of splits and that we couldn't all kind of get along at the end of the day. But the Catholic Church just became so evil in the 16th century that Luther just had to do this. It just had to be done in order to stop the Catholic Church. When you hear that type of, I don't know if it's even an objection, but that type of, I don't know, claim, what goes through your mind? How would you respond?
So I think this gets wrong, both the theology and the history. I'm going to talk about the theology problems first and then apply those to the history. So the question could be put this way, like, how evil do my neighbors have to be before I'm allowed to go into schism? And I think if you frame it that way, then you realize the answer should be that is totally not the Christian approach to the church. Jesus in John 17 prays that all will be one as he and the Father are one. St. Paul in Galatians 5:19-20 warns those who commit schism do not inherit the kingdom of God. So if the question is, how evil does my neighbor have to be before I commit spiritual suicide, which is what schism is, then the answer should be, well, never. And we can put that pretty clearly because, as I've said, there's church corruption in every age, including the age of the apostles. John 6, Jesus tells us in the very last verse, did I not call you the 12? And one of you is a devil. So you can ask this, like, how many apostles have to be like Judas before you can break away from the apostles and start your own church? And the answer is never. That is never the appropriate time. Schism is always wrong. Jesus prays for his future followers to be one, knowing what the future is going to hold. He looks forward and sees all of the evil and corruption and everything else going on in every age, including in the 16th century. And he doesn't say, Lord, I pray that people know they have the need to, if they need to create a new church, they can. Rather, he creates a church, promises the gates of hell won't overcome, and then tells us to stay one. It couldn't be clearer. So the problem is that you have, prior to the Reformation, in the 15th century, you have two figures, Jan Hus and John Wycliffe. And they argue that the true church isn't the one Jesus describes in Matthew 13, where he compares it to a net containing good and bad fish, those destined for heaven and those destined for hell, or a field containing wheat and weeds, where we're told not to weed the garden because in doing so we might pull up some of the wheat as well. No. In this view, the true church is just the saved, even though that is never the way the church is described in the New Testament. That's not true of ancient Israel. Israel wasn't just only pure and holy people, as anyone reading the Old Testament is aware. So this view that the new Israel, the new people of God, is only the saved takes hold, but it leads to some ridiculous conclusions. They have to say that even though Judas is a bishop and an apostle, that he's somehow not part of the church. Now, think about 1 Corinthians 12. When describing the church, says first apostles. The body of Christ includes apostles. definitionally. You don't have an apostle who's not part of the body of Christ. Judas is an apostle, very clearly is an apostle. He's one of the 12. Jesus calls him one of the 12, and yet he's also described as a devil. That doesn't compute in Jan Hus or John Wycliffe's theology. But that becomes really influential, and it's the way it's formed both the reformers and even modern Protestants as well. Because if you're imagining the church as this all holy body, then the problem of church corruption, whether it's Judas or scandals in the 16th century or scandals today, is enough to make me wonder if I need to split off and form my own new denomination. No one in the early church is doing that because that's not how this works. That's not what the church looks like. I mean, you occasionally have fringe bodies like the Montanists who imagine themselves to be all pure and perfect. But that is not the Christian conception of the church from the time of the Bible forward. So that's what I say before you even get the history wrong, you get the theology wrong. You're looking for the wrong thing. You're understanding the word church to mean something that doesn't mean in the Bible. And then you're applying it to a romanticized and dramatized vision of the 16th century, where Luther and the early Protestants are depicted as much better than they really were, and the Catholics of the day are depicted as much worse than they really were. And it becomes this kind of Manichaean struggle of good and evil, which doesn't do justice to the actual historical evidence. So all that's to say, I think someone saying this was like a necessary evil has gotten it half right. It was an evil, but evil's never necessary.
Wow. Well, Joe, you knocked it out of the park. Before we end today's episode, is there anything that you should tell the audience about, like where we can find more of your work? I know that you have the podcast, Shameless Popery, Catholic Answers. Where else can we find your work?
Yeah, I've got several books as well. And you can get those on shop.catholic.com or Amazon or your local Catholic bookstore. And so in terms of this topic, looking at the early church, I've got a book called The Early Church Was the Catholic Church that does like a deeper historical dive, not in the 16th century, but of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. That might be of interest to people who thought this was an interesting episode. And then, I have a weekly podcast called Shameless Popery, and I work full-time for Catholic Answers, so you can often see myself over at Catholic.com.
Nice. Well, and Joe, we know that the episode is going to do well because Sebastian, my cat, actually appeared. So whenever my cat appears, especially during, an episode, people usually love it. So I think Sebastian liked it.
I think you got an easy thumbnail,
That's right.
Feed with the cat.
All right. Well, Joe, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.